So, well then, with that said, why don't we begin with the scripture that I have for today. I just realized I don't even have my notes out here. I got the slideshow up, but I don't have my notes. So let me start here. The scripture that I chose for today that, and man, I was going through, there was quite a few different verses of scripture that I thought would be suitable for what we want to talk about. But especially because we're limited with time and I don't know exactly where we're going to end, I chose this one in particular. And maybe if somebody would like to read it for us, we are in Colossians 3, verse 1 to 4. I could read it if you want, or does somebody have a Bible? You want to go for it?
Rules for holy living. Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you for reading that. You have been raised with Christ. Seek the things that are above. Seeking the things that are above. I just feel like that might be a good theme for where I want to go today. A lot of what I want to touch on is the idea that servanthood and our actions, our practical actions in the world, the things that we're doing, flow out of our inner self and who we are, and a cultivation of those virtues within us. And I want to connect that all to some of the themes that we've been exploring. So, let's begin. I think I'm organized well enough here. I can put this here. It's a lot of technology, right? I'm not a big technology guy. Technology fails. Have you ever, the Mission Impossible franchise? I'm a big fan of the Mission Impossible franchise because in Mission Impossible, technology always fails him. Have you ever noticed that? Anyway, this is a total side note. In James Bond, the technology saves him every time. In Mission Impossible, the technology fails and he has to figure it out. You know what I mean? That's way more realistic. I don't know if climbing on a building in Dubai is more realistic, but anyway. So recap, I just want to go over, this is the kind of heavy stuff that we touched on last week, and it's really important to kind of recognize why this is the key issue. We don't need to get too much into the nitty-gritty detail, but understand why are the debates that are happening within the first 300 years of Christianity so pivotal. Because by the 4th century, and by the time, after Constantine comes to the throne in the early 4th century, and he calls together the council in 325, the Council of Nicaea, and you end up with these 7 ecumenical councils. After that period, you move into the Middle Ages, which roughly spans 500 to 1500 AD. Okay, that's roughly what we call the Middle Ages, often referred to as the Dark Ages. We'll talk about that in a second. But really, in that period of time, Christianity has now taken root. It has sort of taken control of the West. And its influence is going to continue to shoot from there and grow. But the first 300 years are sort of pivotal in marking a number of things. So, as we talked about in week 1, Christianity emerges in this strange God-filled environment, right? It doesn't appear in a vacuum. It appears in the midst of ancient Near Eastern mythologies and all kinds of religious understandings of the world. And it's different in a number of ways, right? It's different because it worships an unrepresentable God who is now found in the person of Jesus Christ. And the Christians have to figure out how to talk about this on, be on the same page with everybody. When Constantine comes to the throne and legalizes Christianity, he doesn't make it the state religion just yet. This is important. The Edict of Milan, what he signs, is Christianity is now legal. You can now practice. You can now come together. You have all the bishops now gathering together going like, well, what are you reading? What are we talking about? Do we all agree? Are we all on the same page about the same things, right? And as heresy begins to arise, it serves as a catalyst for the formation of now what we sort of look at as the doctrinal systems of the Christian faith. So it's actually in this sort of clash with others and disputing voices and in a sort of what we call a dialectical tension that Christianity begins to kind of form itself. Guys like Marcion, and remember Marcion, we talked about him, he was this dualist. He was a Gnostic. That's a vague term that can mean a number of things, but when we use the word Gnostic, what we're really referring to is those who thought of creation itself as sort of a bad thing. The spiritual life was what we are all ascending to. Creation and the created order, this is the world of sin, pain, and corruption, and we want to leave it behind. And that's why it was a heresy, because Christianity is always trying to affirm that the material world matters, right? There's a lot of emphasis. Christ resurrects as a bodily manifestation, okay? The material world matters. But as Marcion grows and starts to get his voice out there and says, no, this God of the Old Testament who created this world is obviously a very bad God, because this is all bad stuff and it's about the spiritual reality that Jesus brings us. That forces the church to then say, okay, we need to be very clear about what it is that we understand. And what emerges is this thing called the regula fide, the rule of faith. People like Irenaeus of Lyons and Polycarp and Clement and Justin Martyr and Origen, those names that I had kind of thrown out, the early apologists. When they get together and they start sharing their writings and their words together, they form this rule of faith, a statement about what it is that the church concretely believes. If we're going to be different together, what is it that makes us different? What is it that makes us unique as a people? And what is it that we have to agree on in order for us to have this diversity of belief? Right? Understand that there is no monolithic understanding of the Christian faith. There's no early church, quote unquote, that is just one whole, unanimous, we all agree across the board. And that's important for us to recognize now, right? Because we have thousands of Protestant denominations, okay? What do we agree on? What's the core thing? And we mentioned, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul, that Christ was raised from the dead, that he suffered under Pontius Pilate, that he appeared to Cephas and the 12. So you have these kind of matter-of-fact statements. The regula fide, the rule of faith, what that becomes when it's finally written down and turned into a concrete statement is the Apostles' Creed. And so the creed is the first kind of, before you even have the Bible, you have the creeds, right? The Bible, and understand the Bible exists not in its canonized form until the 5th century, but the Bible still exists in the sense that these are the letters that are circulating. These are the texts that we're all reading. But Bible's very big. To say we just agree, well, we all agree on the authority of Scripture and everything that it says, well, there's a lot of interpretation that goes into that. So the creed was a way of sort of narrowing down, what is it that we need to affirm in order to be Christians? Well, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and in his one Son, Jesus Christ, right? So, and it carries on from there. But you have this affirmation from the get-go by these early church members, and you see this as well in Paul, that we have to affirm the oneness of God that arises from that Judaic understanding, right? Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema, the prayer, okay? The Lord your God is one. We have to affirm that. And yet, there's something about Jesus that is part of that oneness. How do we understand his distinction and his unity? And so this becomes the sort of pivotal moment. So Constantine is on the throne. He calls together the Council of Nicaea, the first of the great ecumenical councils. And there will be 7 of them. The 2 we're going to kind of focus on is Council of Nicaea and then Council of Chalcedon, which is in 451. Those are the 2 main big ones. The others are important. In the Eastern Church, all 7 are kind of considered like that's the basis for the whole faith. But those 2 are sort of the most pivotal in kind of understanding where we are all sitting doctrinally now, okay? If that makes sense. So Constantine, again, becomes a Christian, sort of debated how much of a Christian Constantine is. There's still a large kind of question mark next to him, or an asterisk, in the sense of like, did some good things, did some bad things. This is a majorly debated topic in academic circles, right? I mean, did Constantine help or hinder the church? There are a lot of people who want to say that like post-Constantine, everything's downhill. Because it's just like, well, once the state got involved with the church, we just went into really bad territory, right? And you can see why that would be the case, right? The radical egalitarianism that I've been talking about, this whole separation of nation and state, all of a sudden is now reinforced in another way. Bishops, for instance, bishops were leaders of church. Well, bishop means a shepherd of a flock. That's where you get that word, right? Okay, the bishopric. But bishops under Constantine are now being bestowed with land and riches. You're being referred to as your holiness. You're reinforcing now a power dynamic that you can see that will be, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? So there's a lot of problems with Constantine. At the same time, don't we want our leaders to be Christian in some sense? Don't we want them to adopt it? Isn't that the natural progression, is that if Christianity grows, eventually the leaders are going to take this on as well? So there's some positives that come about it. He does legalize Christianity. He puts an end to the persecution. He also calls together this council. He gets people together. So it's also disputed how many bishops showed up to the Council of Nicaea, but it's in the hundreds, right? I mean, maybe 300 bishops, all from different areas who are coming together. And this is where you get some really fun stories, right? I don't know if anyone's heard this, but apparently Santa Claus walked across the floor and slapped a guy. Have you ever heard this? Anyone heard this? Saint Nick, Saint Nicholas, who like Santa Claus is later based on, is at the Council of Nicaea. And Arius, because there's these two key figures, Arius is sort of the bad guy, Athanasius is the one who will rise up to be the proper doctrine, or who propagates the proper doctrine. Arius, in his heresy, has said that Jesus is a lot like God, but he's a created being. If you want to understand the really key point to the doctrine of to the Council of Nicaea and what was going on there, it was that Arius was claiming that Jesus was created, not begotten of the Father. Is that making sense? He was created. There was a time when Jesus was not. So you have God the Father, and then Jesus, who is then adopted into the divine life, but he is still a created being, still part of the created order, because he's finite. Well, Saint Nick is so upset by this that he literally walks across the floor of the council and slaps Arius in the face as the story goes. I think it's one of those things where you kind of wonder how truthful any of that is, but that's, St. Nick's punching people. There's a bunch of memes about it, like, yeah, I got a gift for you. Anyway, so that was the debate. And what's important to understand is that the debate is an issue of what we call soteriology. It's soteriological. That is, it's about the doctrine of salvation. What must happen for salvation to occur? Because this is the distinctive essence of the Christian faith. You are saved through the blood of Christ. How? How does Jesus save me vicariously through his death? Like, why does that affect me? And this becomes the main question. How is it that we begin to talk about it? So Athanasius and Arius, they're in this Christological dispute over the nature of Christ, and everyone kind of focuses on that in terms of the grammar, conceptualizing it, right? How is Christ God? In what way is he like God? But the key point to it, and this comes out in a phrase from one of the church fathers, a guy named Gregory of Nazianzus, who ends up saying, that which is not assumed is not redeemed. That's the key component to understanding why this debate has to happen. That which is not assumed is not redeemed. If the fullness of the divine glory does not take on every aspect of the human being, then there are aspects of the human being left out of the salvific process. Then human nature itself is not redeemed. Does that make sense? And so we used that question last week when we were talking about heresy. And we're saying, well, what constitutes heresy? And again, heresy, the point of talking about that was to say heresy isn't about pointing the finger at people and saying, like, you're wrong, you're not allowed to say that, don't do that, we'll burn you at the stake okay? No, it was about inclusion, about unity. Heresy is about how much can you say until you cross a line where, you know what, this is actually going to hurt us more than it's going to help us, right? And I use that example of the Acropolis, the giant structure that's in Greece, and how when they tried to fix it, it's like, okay, the structure's falling apart. How do we fix it? Let's put these steel brackets on. Looks like it's helping. But you can't put steel brackets on the Acropolis, because when the weather changes, it expands, and then all of a sudden it was hurting the very structure. That's what heresy is. It looks like it's helping, but it's actually hurting. So Arius, and this is kind of the important thing, we talk about Athanasius and Arius in the Council of Nicaea, good guy, bad guy. It's not that simple. The Arian controversy lives on way past Nicaea. There are many Arians in the church post this period. And they had to be integrated, and it had to be understood. It was still a heresy, but Arius is a conservative Christian by all other stretches of the imagination. He's trying to help the situation, right? Don't think of him as somebody who's coming in just, knocking heads around trying to create trouble. He's saying, no, this has to be the proper understanding, because we still have to recognize there's a distinction between created world and non-created world. The God who is ineffable can't, how does he reside in the person of Christ? And so the term that comes up, and I wrote this on your handout last week, but it's important to recognize, what Nicaea settles on is something called the homoousia of Christ. That is, Christ is of the same essence as God. Christ is one with the Father. There is a differentiation between them. So I don't know if you've ever seen that picture of the Trinity, where it is like the Father is not the Son is not the Father, Holy Spirit is not the Father, Holy Spirit is not the Son, but all are God in fullness. All share in the same ousia, in the same being. Substantia, substance. Okay, you go back to your Aristotelian categories, substance. Jesus is one with the Father. And what the debate becomes is Arius doesn't want to say they're of the same. He wants to say homoiousia, which means he's like the being of God. And that's the difference. One is created, God is created. The other is no, he's begotten. He proceeds from the Father. So all this terminology, is this making sense? So this is why, by the way, if you ever heard the phrase, it doesn't make an iota of difference, right? You ever heard that? Won't make one iota of difference. Well, that means it shouldn't matter at all, because the iota in the Greek alphabet is the smallest letter, okay? So it doesn't make an iota of difference. But it's sort of a play on words. It's sort of sarcastic, because the truth is the iota made all the difference at the Council of Nicaea. And the iota changes absolutely everything. And it's the paramount heresy, the paramount orthodoxy of the early church. We have to be able to say Christ is homoousia, not homoiousia, because that which is not assumed is not redeemed. Yeah?
Would Arius have known Daniel as a text?
Yes, for
and
sure.
So with that story of Jesus appearing in the fiery furnace, how does he reconcile that? And are Paul's letters considered in this? So
Absolutely.
When you look at
Yep.
the kenosis, how does he justify that?
Well, actually, so the kenosis. and a guy named Cyril of Alexandria. And the debate that ends up happening there is, okay, well, in what way are the human and divine united in the person of Christ? How are they of the same being? How are they a part of the same ousia? And again, the doctrinal sort of final word, the thing that they agree upon at the end that then moves forward is, we are saying Jesus and God are homoousia of the same substance with two natures. And this, again, is where you're getting into the weird terminological weeds, right? You're getting into a lot of Greek categories of philosophy, but it is important to understand, at least just know the formula of the conclusion, okay? Christ is one person, two natures. Okay, and the heresy, that's what's called diophysitism, and I'm giving you really technical terms, diophysitism, physis, nature, okay? That's the Greek word for nature would have been physis, where you get physics. And it's sort of like perceptible change, okay? Jesus is of two natures in one person. That'll be the confirmation of Chalcedon. Not monophysitism, which is, well, he's just one kind of mixture of human and divine. The church had to articulate a way in which they could say, well, no, there is still a distinction between divine and human, but they exist together in the person of Jesus Christ. And that's where they get the term that they land on is consubstantial. He is consubstantial. He is equal in essence to God the Father. Okay? That's the important terminology. Does anyone have any questions on that? I can give you one. Yes, please.
I think, more a remark first, but
Yeah, sure.
it just seems like
This is
we
the
want
most
to
heavy stuff.
nail down, humanly, we want to nail down stuff that's actually full of mystery.
Yeah,
Is kind of what
for
boils
sure.
down to. One question I had though, before I move on to the next century, is there, I know there's the Roman tradition which we kind of have followed,
Yes.
and then there's the Greek or the Eastern
Yes.
Orthodox.
Yep.
Is there any movement of Christianity in Africa or in Asia, or I don't know how?
This is all in Africa and Asia. So So by the time Augustine comes on the scene, for instance, that's North Africa, right? I mean, he's the Bishop of Hippo. This whole thing is going on through Asia Minor, through the East, right? So it's when I say in the West, they're really just talking about European and Eurasia, that kind of, right? And as opposed to like today, the New World. Okay, that's all later. But yeah, those movements are spreading all the way down into Africa, and the politics are different depending on where you go there, of course, right? So the Greek world, which we call Hellenization, right? When Greek influence comes in, that's the Hellenization of the world. That's more popular in certain areas and not so much. So Augustine, for instance, is like not really good with Greek. That's actually been known for that's a major point of scholarship with Augustine, because Augustine really gives us our terminology, our whole conceptual grammar in the West for the church is really understood through an Augustinian lens. That can't be overemphasized. But Augustine is a North African bishop. His Greek wasn't that good. And that has some really interesting, so like a major debate right now, which is the conversation over hell, eternal conscious torment versus annihilationism versus a certain kind of universalism in which hell exists but not at an infinite period of time. A lot of that rests on the Augustinian understanding of Romans 9-11, and there's a question of how much he was really able to read that properly because he didn't understand the Greek. Pretty interesting, right? So you can get into a whole bunch of stuff on this. So Augustine, yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah, so with this conversation, the creation of the Trinity, or the concept of the Trinity, this is obviously the birth of This is kind of the birth of the idea of Trinity?
Yes, yeah, 100%. Well, so actually, and I would say like the birth of the idea of Trinity is totally biblical. You hear all the language of Father, Son, Holy Spirit throughout the Bible. The regula fide is where that's going to become, because the Apostles' Creed is, we believe in one God the Father. We also believe in the Son, Jesus Christ. who proceedeth from the, and the Spirit that proceedeth from the Father and the Son. I don't want to get into a huge thing here, but that's the main controversy, by the way, between East and West, is something called the Filioque clause. Have you ever heard of this? Well, I'll just touch on it. Don't feel like I don't want to lose anybody here. Filioque clause. This is basically what separated and still does separate a lot of Roman Catholicism from the East, and why there's a split is single line within the creed that says the Spirit proceedeth from the Father and the Son. Does the Spirit proceed from just the Father? That's East. The West says no, it proceeds from the Father and the Son. Okay? So understanding the Trinitarian relations became this major, it's a silly debate. I'm going to tell you right now, there's no reason why two churches should be split over this nonsense. But at the same time, it's not nonsense. It's important stuff. My point is there's better reasons to be unified with people than to argue over this kind of stuff. And in the long run, I should give credit. I mean, the East and West aren't still divided simply on this basis. But it's a big point of contention, right? Was understanding these Trinitarian relations. I want to put it, the next slide here is just a great way of summing it up. This is David Bentley Hart in The Story of Christianity. And this is just the logic of Nicaea. If it is the Son who joins us to the Father, and only God can join us to God, then the Son is God. Okay? So, that which is not assumed is not redeemed. God is the only one who can connect us to God. Okay? If it is the Son who joins us to the Father, and only God can join us to God, then the Son is God. And if, in the sacraments of the church and the life of faith, it is the Spirit who joins us to the Son, and only God can join us to God, then the Spirit too must be God. So there's your Trinitarian logic in a very simple form. And like you said, Vern, that is a lot of mystery trying to be articulated. And this is where we kind of have to understand there's a real deep simplicity to the Trinity in this sense, and it's a doctrinal statement that we're making. But theologically, it will always be, you can plumb deeper and deeper. Always. And we're always trying to articulate language for that. We're still kind of working through exactly in what way is Christ homoousia, okay? That's the work of theology, is continuing to do this. But, and that's at the end of the Council of Chalcedon, or Chalcedon, however you want to pronounce it, the Tome of Leo, which is written, is really this affirmation of sort of the Trinitarian relations. And what's so important about it is that it's this doctrinal leap forward for the church. We have to affirm this for the basis of salvation, okay? Because this is how Christianity stands apart, how it's unique, because it has this distinct relationship between the material world, Christ, through whom all things were made, and the Father, for whom all things were made. And all of this proceeds, or the Spirit connects all of this, right? The bond and boundary of love that keeps it all together. That needs to be affirmed. But theologically, it's not like ironclad, pinned down, we understand this. It is an ineffable mystery in some sense. So by the time you get to Augustine, who's writing deeply on the Trinity, De Trinitate, he's not trying to explain it like it's some sort of mathematical equation. He's trying to understand it as an ontological framework. There's that word ontology, being, okay, as a framework for understanding our lives. And this is exactly why, if we could move out of the kind of weeds of the academic language and all this stuff, this is exactly why this is so important, why we want to talk about this. Ideas matter. And what this is affirming, what the councils are affirming, is essentially, it goes back to that word metaphysic. What is the nature of reality itself? And if Christ is the connection between the divine and the human, through whom all things were made, right? Go to John's prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. That is a massive affirmation. Unless we can settle on this, we don't have this unique conceptual grammar from which to understand everything else in the world, because now the Christian is unique in its placement of saying metaphysics itself rests on the person of Jesus Christ. That's huge. Okay? That is such a different way of looking at the world. It means that everything that we do comes through Jesus, his person specifically. And this was kind of the connection I'm trying to make. Again, like, this might be academic, highfalutin, ivory tower stuff, but this is the kind of thing that then trickles down and informs the nature of economics, politics, social relationships. This is we're all deriving stuff from what's happened here. And then the world will create its own sort of metaphysical understanding, and it's for the church to kind of say, here's where that makes sense and here's where it doesn't. But it's on this basis. Ideas matter. And part of the thing is we sometimes think that, oh, okay, well, maybe I affirm something more like what Arius affirmed, maybe. Okay, maybe that's my thinking. That doesn't really affect anybody in my immediate consequence, right? Like it doesn't have an immediate repercussion. That doesn't mean it doesn't affect things. There's a group of people in the world right now who are growing in number who believe that the earth is flat, okay? There's a flat earth society. We might kind of laugh at it as trivial. It is right now. But if that continues to grow, you think that's going to be a problem? It's going to be a huge problem. Think about what will happen if we actually just go on allowing people to think that the earth is flat. Okay? You're regressing. That'll change technology. It'll change all kinds. For one, it breeds a huge skepticism in the world, right? Everyone's lying to us. Okay? These ideas matter. And what I'm trying to make the connection of today, if we can just go right now to the why statement about a community of servants, it sort of rests on, and do I have oh no, that'd be the next couple of slides, so I am jumping ahead a little bit here. But Mark 10:45, even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. If we understand Christ as the pinnacle of human nature, if Christ and the divine if all our metaphysics are united in the person of Christ, and Christ came in the form of a slave, Philippians 2, then that tells us something about our goal, right? That tells us something, and it changes the kind of outlook. I think kind of what I'm trying to do with this statement is say, like, yeah, we're a community of servants, but the goal of the Christian life isn't to just try and find everything that a good servant would do and do it. The goal of the Christian life actually, and this is kind of where I want to go here, is Galatians 4:19, that Christ be formed within you, okay? The chief end of man, that Christ be formed within you. That's the purpose. And if Christ is formed within you, you'll be a servant. But it's that way. That's the order of events, okay? We don't just look at a kind of checklist of like, well, this was what would make me a good servant, okay? No, it's that I have Christ formed in me, and then service and servant, participating in that is sort of my natural inclination. It's my way of participating in the divine logos, let's say. So I hope is that making sense? Yeah. So it's kind of the broad sense in which I want to look at this, is that all of this actually has major practical application. Christ's nature, and what is human nature? That's what we're going to kind of talk about, if we can get to it in the second half, is what is human nature? What are the aspects of our human nature that then need to be directed and ordered toward Christ, so that Christ being formed in us creates this mood and attitude of charity within us that's sort of our natural disposition, right? Because a lot of this has to be framed too around the gospel. The gospel is very clear. I think one of the most radical verses in all of Scripture, Galatians 5:1, for freedom's sake, Christ has set you free. For freedom's sake. Like this isn't about like a rule of like, oh, you got to be in service to other people. No, you are free. 1 Corinthians 6:12, 10:23, you are free in all things, but not everything's good for you. Okay, but you're free in everything. That is the basis of the gospel, is this understanding of freedom. Well, how is freedom then submitted to a perfect obedience? I mean, it's one of my favorite theological questions, really, is examining the freedom of Christ himself. Is Christ free? I want to say that Christ is more free than any of us, right? I think that makes sense. Christ is also more obedient than any of us, right? He who sins is a slave to sin. See, we have a I know I'm going off on a different thing here, but this is such an important thing. We have a radically different notion. Our understanding of freedom is informed largely by our politics. And most of us think of freedom in a sort of libertarian sense. You know, American freedom means, you know, I get to do whatever I want when I want. That's not true. Freedom is not defined that way. Freedom is not defined by your ability to choose. It's defined by your ability to choose well. That's freedom, okay? That's such an important point. Freedom requires discipline. It requires obedience in order to do it. I often look at it this way. The metaphor I like to give is like, somebody would have a piano in this room and say, like, Ben, you are free to play that piano whenever you want. No, I'm not. I have no idea how to play the piano. You might let me, but I haven't disciplined myself. I haven't practiced. I don't know how to play the piano, so I'm not free to play the piano. Only until I dedicate myself, discipline myself, train myself, am I actually free. So Christ is the most free. But Christ is without sin, right? And so we want to look at our freedom and we say, well, my freedom is my ability to choose to sin or not sin. No, it's not. Your ability to choose to sin doesn't make you more free. It makes you less free, actually. Because Christ didn't have, and then so when you get into these councils, this actually becomes the next debate. Monophysitism, diophysitism, that's the first kind of Chalcedon, right? One nature or two natures, okay? He's got a divine and a human nature. The next sort of debate, which comes out with a guy named Maximus Confessor, is how about the will? One will or two wills? How many wills does Jesus have? And again, the affirmation, he's got two wills. He's got a human will, but he's got a divine will. And the point is they're aligned with each other. Okay? That the human will doesn't fight the divine will. And I used this actually in a sermon before, but when we talk about the Trinity, the relations of the Trinity is something called perichoresis, the perichoretic movement of the Trinity. The Father hands everything over. All power and authority is gifted to Christ. What does Jesus do? Hand it right back, right? Just game of tennis, just back, right? Okay? Holy Spirit just giving it back and forth, right? It's this movement of divine self-giving. It was a guy named Hans Urs von Balthasar called it the kenosis. So it's using that kenosis phrase again, but to talk about the Trinity. The self-emptying into each other of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And until we kind of get that basis, then we understand the metaphysics of reality based in the Trinity means servanthood in its being itself. You see? And so all of this language applies incredibly to what it means when we say we want to be servants. When you say you want to be a servant, you don't just mean I want to feed the poor or something like that. I mean, I want to be formed as Christ is formed. It's not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And when Christ lives in me, then I am a servant to all. I'm a slave to all, right? That's the language. So, awesome. Okay, I feel like that's, where are we here? Got another 10 minutes. 10 minutes before we'll take a break. The next thing I want to talk about, because we're going to move into in the second half just talking about the actual practical things about servanthood and ordering ourselves, a more practical theology. But just carrying on with the historical kind of things that we've been talking about, just talking about the Christian influence. As I said, by the time you're after these councils and after this sort of first 300-year period, Christianity has now sort of really taken root in the world. It doesn't quite finish with Constantine, understand that. His son comes to the throne and does some other stuff, and then you have eventually the rise of Emperor Julian, who really tries to go back to like pagan antiquity. He tries to get rid of Christianity again, so it's not the same kind of persecutions as it was in the first 300 years. Christianity's grown substantially, right, exponentially. There's so many of them. But there are still movements kind of for and against the Christian movement, and the Roman Empire will eventually fall in the 5th century. And so there's a sort of question of now Christianity is really cultivating itself in the world. And what does it offer? And what is it doing? And what is it producing, right? And there's good and bad, and there's kind of two trajectories here, or at least two theories on it, or people have written books kind of for or against whether it was good or bad. Like some people have written that it's because of Christianity that the Roman Empire fell, and they look at that as a negative thing in the sense that we destroyed antiquity. You know, we got rid of the art and all the things that Rome had produced. Well, is that true? There's a major work by Edward Gibbon, a guy who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's like one of the great works of classical literature And that was his whole thing. He was like, Christianity, when it got involved with the state, certainly did some bad stuff. It did. Okay, there were some iconoclasts, people who smashed pagan temples, people who forced the baptism of Jews, right? I mean, like it's not Christian behavior. But is that really Christianity at work? And so there's a thesis out there that's trying to say that's when we moved into the Dark Ages, the medieval period, because Christendom took root and it tried to snuff all these things out. And I want to just battle that today. This is a quote from G.K. Chesterton. Christianity, so far from belonging to the Dark Ages, was the one path across the Dark Ages that was not dark. That's very true, and I'm going to explain that in a second. But just to kind of look at the basic sort of areas in which Christianity had a major influence, and we've talked about these. So we have the egalitarian shift that erodes national and ethnic boundaries. Then you have women's rights, right? That's a huge thing. The equality of women becomes a major part of the first movement. You have women who are leading house churches, all kinds of things like that. The abolishment of slavery begins to be talked about. I mentioned this as well with Gregory of Nyssa, one of the Cappadocian fathers, who saying, you're made in the image of God, therefore you cannot own people as property. Then hospitals and public education. Again, Constantine did give a lot of charity. He did do a lot for kind of building programs to help the poor. Well, that became the job of the bishops. That became the fundamental kind of the caretaking of the church, or the role that the church had to play in the first 3 centuries. And then it leads, and this is kind of where the bigger point that I want to move to, is that then it cultivated the arts. It cultivated, in people like Justin Martyr and Origen, who I talked about. Justin Martyr was known as Justin the Philosopher, right? You start to see this spark of the intellectual tradition that is then built from Christianity onward, where the cultivation of the sciences, what will become the sciences, and the humanities, literature, art, architecture, all of this has this place within Christianity that it proliferates from. That Christianity really serves to edify the world in some way. And the way this really can be shown is through what comes next in the historical progression, which is the rise of monasticism. The monks were part of what's called the ascetic tradition. Asceticism is sort of a devotion to a life of poverty, of service, of self-denial. But it was also the cultivation of literature, art, kind of humanitarian work, if you will. Like this was a major part of what the ascetic tradition was. Often we think of these things as being really austere, really severe and strict, and depriving ourselves. And indeed, in some places, it did become like that, and it became a sort of other movement of idolatry. But at the end of the day, what the monks were trying to go after here, and the rise of monasticism was really focused on, was the simple life. Having a simplicity to our living. And I think I'm trying to connect this, I will try and connect this in the second half, to a little bit more of this sense of servanthood, of the way in which we cultivate ourselves within the community that we live, of having this time for our devotion, our quiet, living a contemplative life, which we then move into the world with, and then we withdraw at certain times, okay? The criticism that happens with the rise of monasticism is that what's called the Benedict option. So Saint Benedict of Nursia, who becomes one of the most famous of these sort of orders, and they were known as the black monks. They always wore black. That's okay. You'll note that's every different monastery had their different traditions. But the Benedict option was basically to abscond from society, to leave society, to live this contemplative life, because the world is such a horrible place. But that became a major criticism of the movement, because it was like, well, that's a cop-out. You're not, is this all about your salvation, or is it about everyone's salvation? Shouldn't you be here in the trenches fighting it out with us? Shouldn't you be trying to evangelize within the world? You can't just, as a Christian, you are called to be in the world and not of the world, but you're in the world. You can't just leave and go live in the hills. Well, the point I want to make is there's actually some wisdom to it. It's not so clear that it's just cut and dry one or the other. There is wisdom in separating ourselves a little bit from society and still working within society. And a lot of monks didn't just do this. They weren't just hermits. The Desert Fathers, where this all begins, were hermits. They lived out in the wilderness. And this is what gets criticized. By the time of Benedict and these other movements, you have the Franciscans from Francis of Assisi, you have the Norbertines. I can show you in a second. I actually visited the Norbertines in France. They do more pastoral work. They are actually involved in their communities. They actually do work, but they live in this life of contemplation, and it's moderation over austerity. And the point that comes out of this that's important, again, is that during this time, the monks are really the only people concerned with preserving libraries and all of what's left of antiquity. I have a quote here somewhere. Just trying to see if I have it. But I haven't been looking at my notes, so I'm completely lost. Where do I have it? Devote yourself to... Yeah, became the dominant Western practice. Monks preserved everything. No, I had it. Okay, I can't find it anymore. In the 6th century, so for instance, like Boethius, the Christian philosopher, he undertakes the work of producing translations of Plato and Aristotle. So really, the quote, if I recall it, I'll try and find it for later, but it basically, again, from David Bentley Hart, being like the only people who have any sort of connection with antiquity, with actually keeping the past awake, involved, alive, are the monks, are the Christians, who see an importance in this idea that, and we talked about it with Justin Martyr, right? All truth is God's truth. If Christ is the homoousia, if Christ is the eternal logos, the rationality of all things, then the cultivation of all things that are good, true, and beautiful needs to be protected. And so when in the world with the fall of the Roman Empire and you had all these fights and wars and people trying to crush this culture so our culture could thrive, Christians saw more of a unity of actually we can take these things and we can Christianize them. We don't need to be iconoclast. We don't need to tear it down. We can preserve. It's one of the reasons why one of the recommended readings, I think it was in week 1, was From Plato to Christ. This idea of we don't need to take Plato and say he has nothing to do with revelations. We get rid of him. There's something deeply important to what Plato had said that needs to be preserved and thought through in a Christian way. And the Christians in the monastic period, for instance, were those during the Dark Ages when the state was doing all kinds of terrible things in the name of religion, that preserved these good things, that wanted to push to an ascetic life of let's be disciplined, let's be obedient, but let's also cultivate beauty in the world. Making sense? All of this stuff is completely part of what the church understands itself as having produced in the world. All things are made through Christ. And so this idea of natural theology becomes commonplace in the Middle Ages, that God and reason work together, and that we are predicated. What's the first thing that we know about God is that he's a creator. And so this cultivation of creativity, the arts, flows from the epicenter of Christian thought. And by the 11th century, you have the formation of the university. Almost every university that was founded pre-19th century, and still many afterward, are Christian institutions. It needs to be understood that there has to be an understanding that far from being some kind of superstitious, religious, you guys live over here in your fairyland. No. We are the reason, Christians are the reason why the Enlightenment project happened. Okay, that Christianity was always the religion of the logos, so science is born out of exactly what Christians were always trying to do. And I'm trying to say this because this is a broader sense in which we think of servanthood. It's a broader way in which the church serves the world. When we talk about our service, I think we sometimes talk about really practical down to I feed the person who's hungry. Definitely it involves that. That's a huge part of it. But there's a broader sense in which the world hungers for meaning and purpose. And the church feeds the world meaning and purpose. It edifies creation. That's what we do. We create something beautiful. And we have to begin there. And so let's take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about that. I want to get into what are called the transcendentals: truth, beauty, goodness, and the way in which Christianity sort of pushes those out into the world and the way in which it's tried to cultivate those things. Okay, good. Any questions before we do a break on anything that I've said so far? I know felt like a good recap though, right? There was probably some good clarification, I hope, on some of those terms, because those are difficult. Okay, well, let's go grab a coffee. So yeah, just as we're getting back in, again, I'll just start by, we're just talking about some of the readings here, so I'll just go into those before we carry on here. Renovation of the Heart by Dallas Willard. The books on this week's suggested reading are, I think, a little bit different in scope. The books before have kind of been on this more historical, doctrinal journey. But in talking about servanthood and talking about practical theology and sort of the things we actually do in the world and how we influence it, these books are more geared toward that, more geared toward a sort of cultivation of spiritual practice, okay? So Renovation of the Heart by Dallas Willard. I know, Mark, you've read it and done it in a Bible study. Are people familiar with Dallas Willard? My mentor is Harry Gardner from Acadia Divinity College, former president. Harry, he's just, so I meet with Harry regularly, and he's just been a constant kind of source for me. And I would always say, my wife and I always talk about Harry as he is a person who walks with God. That's how I just describe him. Harry's mentor was Dallas Willard. And he was trained by Dallas in, what seminary was he in? I can't remember. I don't know, somewhere in the States. Anyway, that was Harry's. Fuller? Oh, maybe it was Fuller. Yeah, I can't remember anymore, actually. Dallas Willard. But Dallas Willard was a philosopher more than anything. But Harry always explained Dallas as somebody who walks with God. And if you get a chance and if you haven't read any of his books, you can also check him out on YouTube. He's got a number of things. Really good. And we're going to get into it, actually. I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the things that Dallas has put out there. The other one is The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. Has anybody read that or heard of that? Have you read that, Jake? Never? Okay. Yeah, you have. Okay, excellent. It's one of the great works of the sort of late medieval period, and that's why I put it in there. I always want to give a text that's sort of toward the history that we're talking about. Thomas à Kempis is contemplative mystic theology, in a sense, so really the imitation of Christ, a real sort of practical journey through spiritual formation. And what those practices look like, what your prayer life looks like, those kinds of things. Incredibly wise, interesting book. So I just put that on there as of interest. The last one I do highly recommend. It is called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World by Tom Holland. We were just talking about it a little bit at the break there. Tom Holland, important to know, is not a Christian. I really feel like he's on the border. Like he's so close. I don't know. Like everything he says, you're like, buddy, you're a Christian, right? Like, I mean, like just admit it. Just, put the sword down and join us. But he claims he's an agnostic, but he basically has understood. He's a historian who's a historian of the Roman Empire. When he was reading the Bible as a kid, he was really more interested in the Egyptians are interesting, the Babylonians are interesting, Rome. Okay, so he studied all of those. And what he basically came to understand is a lot of what I've been saying is that the revolution that comes with Christianity is so utterly unique to the ancient world. Like it is so vastly different that even today, these things that we take for granted as sort of universal human truths, the equality of people, our abhorrence with things like slavery and sexual immorality. Well, actually, that one's maybe up in the air. But our abhorrence to those things is completely gifted to us by the Christian tradition, and he's trying to kind of explain how that works. So he'd get into a lot of it, like for instance, Darwinian evolution. even understanding that as much as that created issues for the church, it's in its conception, it's a completely Christian notion that even the survival of the fittest, the idea that all of nature is dictated by one simple law, comes from this same monotheistic tradition, if you will. So what he's trying to argue there, and he's a great writer. I think that's another thing that, like, if you're going to read a book that's sort of like a chapter's bestseller and you want something like that, it's a good one. But it helps us think a lot about, I was actually thinking of putting him on the suggested reading for next week, because what I want to talk about next week is, in the final statement, we want to be relevant and authentic. I think we should end on kind of talking about where is the church now? What's its relevance to the world? And how do we situate ourselves in a post-Christian age? We really are in a post-Christian world. It's been a major emphasis of most of my research and study for the last several years, is this idea of secularity. What does secular mean? How does the church see itself? And I think, Gavin, you were raising just now, a good question about the practical importance of some of these works. Is somebody who is reading this really going to benefit from the kind of history that he's given there, when their understanding of Christianity, what's been handed to them, is perverted or distorted in such a way that I think we deal now with people largely won't even look at Christianity as being an entertainable option. Right? It just doesn't even, like, why would I ever go to a church given the PR that's really come out of it? That's part of the reason why I do what I do, is when I said at the beginning of this course that I wanted it to be apologetically centered, apologetically being a defense for the Christian faith. A lot of Christian apologetics today is more a sort of historical, kind of like, did Jesus really rise from the dead, right? You could go into that stuff. I'm more interested in apologetics that reshapes our fundamental questions about theology. Going back through the kind of, let's take a look at the tradition of church history and come to a place of maybe understanding why we even perceive it the way we perceive it. That's why I'm big on this thesis, and it was made popular by Charles Taylor. He wrote a book called A Secular Age. I've mentioned him now a few times, right? Big 900-page book, kind of the reigning text for understanding atheism in the West, for understanding secularism. And his whole thesis there is this notion that the secular, when we talk about secular, we're talking about a-religious, non-religious. But his argument is that secularity is not a subtraction theory. Secularity is not what you get when you just minus religion from the equation, right? So you take something in the world and you remove the religious shell from it, and then you have the secular. Taylor says, no. The secular is born out of the religious ethos. You don't just subtract it. This secularity is a sort of parasite on the religious substructure, if you will. That religion, even secularity itself, is a religion. So this is one of the reasons, and this is a very offensive thing that I love to say to atheists, is that I don't really believe they're atheists. Really. I mean, I don't. Because as long as you still have meaning and purpose, you have a God of some kind. And the great atheists of history, like Friedrich Nietzsche, understood that that's not the case. That if you remove God, you remove meaning. And we have to recreate our understanding, and that goes into a sort of Darwinian evolutionary understanding of the world, survival of the fittest. The strong survival. You see, when Darwin came on the scene, he was challenging deeply this Christian notion that strength is found in weakness, that humility is a good thing, that servanthood is something we're trying to cultivate, right? Darwin's theory kind of challenged that from a naturalistic perspective, said, no, the whole order of creation is that the weak will get left behind. Well, now, but see, and this is what Tom Holland's trying to say in his book, is he's saying, but they still had this Christian thing in the back of their head that said, but we're not going to but of course we need to take care of the weak. We're not going to just let them die. Why? If it's all just survival of the fittest, why do you care? Right? And the atheist wants to look at the Christian and say, like, well, that's terrible that you would need a God in order. It's like, it's not that I need a God to say that. It's that that's what God is. That's what he supplies is my foundation. What's your ontic referent? What is your basis for understanding why any of that applies and why it's not just subjective? So that book helps to unpack all of that stuff and recognize the sort of way in which our language in general is Christianized. And that's good for us because it helps us to recognize where the aberrations of Christian theology have gone, right? That you, just because you're a member of a church and you confess Christ doesn't mean that you'll be safe from idolatry. You can turn Jesus into an idol, right? You can turn him into a machination of your own understanding, let's say. That's a huge kind of part of the movement that happens in the 20th century in liberal theology. Karl Barth, greatest theologian of the 20th century, even according to Catholics, right? The Pope said he was the greatest theologian since Aquinas. For a Catholic to say that about a Protestant, it's a pretty big deal. Barth would begin his lectures by citing one of the greatest atheists of his day, Feuerbach, and saying about God being the projection of human beings, right? That God is essentially a larger version of us in the sky, and that's what we turn God into. And he's saying, no, you have to change that notion. God is ultimate freedom. The I am who I am. We need to dictate ourselves by that. And this is what's so important, again, of recognizing the kind of growth of Christianity, understanding what it offers the world, what it does, and all going back to these councils, what they're emphasizing is that recognizing that the Christ who is the incarnate Son of God is the incarnation of the God who is ineffable, is the incarnation of the God who is perfect in freedom, who will be what he will be. And that emphasis has to continuously get played back into our kind of ways of thinking. And I keep using this word too, I want everybody to understand it, dialectical thought, dialectical theology. Dialectic in the ancient Greek kind of sense of it just is simply argument, right? Argument, dialectic, right? I advance an argument and you push back on it. And by pushing back, we sort of move through. Plato believed that dialectic could be very dangerous. You shouldn't teach dialectic to the youth because they would just use it to just poke people in the side, right? And that's, Plato himself was like that. He was called the gadfly, right? He just annoyed people. But dialectic theology is this understanding of that oscillation of kind of a mediating between, right? God being human and God being fully divine. And never the two shall meet. There's a difference between those two, but he's both fully those things. And that's why I've said this before too, that the Christian history can kind of be understood as this oscillation between immanence and transcendence. Emphasis on the transcendent otherness of God, and then moving back to an understanding of God being within the material world, being of the world, being with creation. So the liberal movements, when we talk about liberal theology, we're often talking about that immanent shift, right? That move into like, God is the ground of being itself. God is in the world. He is in and through all things. Moving now the oscillation to the more conservative end, which is the radical transcendence of God. When you get to people like John Calvin, who the great Reformed tradition that arises, Calvin is so particular about the sovereignty of God. God is above all things. Well, you can go way too far in that direction, right? If you don't kind of bring yourself back to and I don't want to put this all on John Calvin, but I will put it on the Calvinistic tradition, okay? That pushes God into this realm of like so transcendent and so other that he doesn't even need to be good anymore because it doesn't need to make sense to our version of good. Okay? Yeah, you know exactly what I mean, right? He got into double predestination, that God damns people to hell for his own glorification. That's an abhorrent doctrine in my opinion, okay? I will not live by that doctrine. But you can get there if God is so utterly transcendent that even our notions of good don't need to equate to God, right? I could stay there for a second, actually. This becomes part of the intellectual tradition that arises in the Middle Ages. And another thing that's developed through the humanities, through the cultivation of the university. You have a period called the Scholastic period. And the Scholastic period would have been what Thomas Aquinas was a part of. And it was this really really intense, again, ascetic understanding of trying to formulate doctrine, trying to give reason to the Christian faith. So people like Thomas Aquinas were proponents of natural theology, the idea that we can understand God with reason. Okay, reason is the handmaid to theology. Important that he always said handmaid to theology, as in reason doesn't dictate, because human reason is flawed and sinful, but guided by the light of revelation, it can bring us to places that are important, right? It can cultivate us. Guys like Karl Barth later on challenge that notion. They move away from natural theology. They say you can't look at no, we're too sinful. God's too transcendent, right? See the oscillation happening, okay? And so we're always mediating between those. It's just kind of an important thing for what we're trying to cultivate, is that we're always looking at a balance, a certain harmony. I wanted to get to a bigger point about why this is important for servanthood, because again, I was going to this more abstract idea that the way in which Christianity serves the world isn't just through the on-the-ground practical things of just feeding the poor, okay? And of course, that is sort of the main, for the first 3 centuries, that was the main point of the church. Feed the poor. Like really, like just care for the needy, okay? And at its basis, if we ever get more complicated than that, I think we're in trouble. So I do want to emphasize that is your goal, okay? Care for those who need care. But then there's this broader notion. Jesus says, man does not live on bread alone. I am the bread of life. There is a sense in which the world hungers for other things that Christianity provides. And here's where I wanted to talk about the transcendentals. I don't think I have a slide for it, but I'll just write it down. So the transcendentals are beauty, truth, and goodness. Am I spelling all this right? I don't know. Why is it that when I print, I just all of a sudden my brain goes loopy? Maybe it's because I'm trying to talk while I'm writing, but all of a sudden I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing here. This is the first time. Anyway, so beauty, truth, and goodness are the transcendentals. And what we mean by that, when we say that in theology, is that these are not just attributes of God, they are what God is. God is beauty. He is goodness. He is truth in himself. And it's important for our understanding, because this is what I'm ultimately trying to say in relation to servanthood, is that this is what is cultivated in the world through the Christian faith. We serve the world by giving it these things, by beauty, by proliferating or putting forth that which is beautiful, that which is true, and that which is good. Because as we imitate Christ, we should be a reflection of those things, right? And how we understand them. So this gets into now this notion again where these ideas matter, because in the modern age, these are not, beauty, truth, and goodness aren't transcendentals anymore. They are just, they're just categories, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Beauty's subjective. I can think anything's beautiful. No, you can't. I don't believe that. I want to make that very clear, actually, because this is another way in which, the art and humanities, the literature that was produced out of the Christian world was some of the best art ever produced. And it's objectively better than a lot of the stuff that's produced now. And it's not, when you say beauty is subjective, you're also saying God is not real, in a sense, because if God is the transcendental, right? If he is beauty, truth, and goodness, then to say beauty is subjective is to say that God is subjective. It's to say, right? No, God is beauty. Now what that means, and sorry if I'm complicating this too much, but it's important to recognize that in saying that God is beautiful, God is infinite in modality. So that's the term I would like to use in order to explain what I mean. As in, you can find a sunset just as beautiful as a rainy day. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but those two things are part of something that is beautiful, and certain other things are not beautiful. When we talk about beauty sometimes, we talk about trends, like things that become in fashion at a certain time. You can look at architecture and say, that's beautiful. You can look at other architecture and say, that's really ugly. My point, again, is to say that there's an objective sense in which that's true. And Christianity was, at least at one point, really focused on cultivating what was beautiful in those things, what was eternal in those things. You can look at certain buildings, for instance, in architecture and say, that did look good a while ago, and now it no longer does. It's kind of out of fashion. But I would challenge you, I doubt you'd ever say that about Buckingham Palace, right? You would never say that about nature. You'd never walk and see a sunset or a sunrise or a waterfall or something and go like, this is so outdated, right? You don't talk about creation in that way. It's beautiful. It's good. It's what bodies forth from God. And so, yeah, I get that there might be a more, I've kind of led on this more abstract idea of talking about this in relation to servanthood, but the point is that Christianity wanted to cultivate these things. I gave a slide, actually, on this. I was wondering how I was going to try and fit this in. Oh, I'll show you these too. I stayed with the Norbertine canons in France. So this is what I was going to say. So the monks, I wanted to connect this again with the historical movement of Christianity, is that the monks really did cultivate these things, the liberal arts. It's where it all kind of grows. The formation of the university, formation of actually being people of the text and writing words and doing those things. And again, their criticism was that they were always too far removed from society, that they were hermits, and we need to. Well, the Norbertines, for instance, are a good example of that mediation. They were not monks. The Norbertine canons, they're called, and a canon means that you're more involved in pastoral work and that you're really involved in your community, but you do live as a separate community. And so this is where I stayed in the middle of. This is in the heart of Avignon, France. And it's just the most gorgeous place. They had a brewery. They had their own brewery, and they would make, of course, because they're a bunch of canons, so they would just have like a beer thing, and then this is where they were. That was the view from my window, actually. It was an incredible town. And then there's the cathedral. So again, I just noticed the emphasis on beauty, right? Now, this is something that gets challenged in the Reformation, obviously. It's something that we can get overly fixated on what we mean by these things. And in some cases, it's the reason why the Baptist church looks very different from the Catholic church, right? Because at a certain point, we're trying to say all this ornate stuff actually can complicate or obfuscate people's personal relationship with God. But I'd like to think of it as simply a different flavor, right? Like it's not, one is not right and one is not wrong. Again, it's sort of showing this oscillation of just thinking between the two things. What do we think of the space we worship in? We want to make it beautiful. We might also want to keep it simplistic, right? We don't want people to be alienated, but at the same time, is there benefit? See, to the Catholics, that form of alienation is actually a good thing, because it's like it shows you that you're participating in something that's different than everything else, right? So it's just different ways of understanding it.
So, and sort of I'm thinking of denominations too. So is there always going to be this sort of a pendulum swing on all of this stuff? Because as you said, so you look at that, which is absolutely so beautiful.
Yeah.
And yet Reformation might come in and say, now you're starting to worship the building and you've got a lost sense of God. Right. So then they remove this stuff and go to more simple, but then you're saying now you've lost a sense of the beauty of God. Yeah. Is there always going to be this sort of...
I think so. I don't think, now, in the way you're saying it, I don't think it means that one will always have to be negated for the other, but you will always, everybody, I remember a theology professor telling me this once, and it has always stayed with me. He just always said, you always have to hold your theology with an open palm. Your theology will always be man-made, always. So you cannot close on your theology. Your theology can change. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have foundational confessions that you make, but you got to keep it open because of these kind of movements, of these oscillations. And it's not about one being wrong. It's about one being fixated on, and then when you consider it to be the only way, then you're in trouble. And this is precisely why what I want to see is a far greater ecumenical movement. And I think you're so dedicated to that. It's one of the reasons why I love partnering with this church, is because I see this broad sense in which it's like we have to recognize ourselves as being really more unified and maybe different in expression. But we're not about to battle with each other over the color of the drapes. Like, that's just silly, right? I don't even want to battle over the filioque clause, right? Even really big doctrinal matters, they might be more important than others, but it's certainly not, it shouldn't keep us apart. And I did find the quote, and then I probably lost it again, but the reason why I wanted to bring it up was, it was simply from David Bentley Hart again, where he was saying, with monasticism, this actually did happen. He says that the work of monasticism led to great periods of harmony and in some cases proliferation of the art and literature in places like Gaul, for instance. He writes, it was during this period that friendships frequently transcended creed. So it was actually with the rise of monasticism, with a more austere order that cultivated these sort of unique, different things, that actually cultivated a much greater sense in which our unity as people is greater than our confession. And I just want to emphasize that because we often think of it as the antithesis, right? We're like, oh, these are boundaries that get set up. Well, not the case. And again, he goes on to say that, of course, it didn't last. Wars break out, nations fight with each other. But by the end of the 5th century, the only cultural institutions that were still intact were the church and its monasteries. That somehow the church and its monasteries lasted through these periods of like the fall of the Roman Empire and through the wars of the barbarians and the Gauls and all that. You know, the Christianity managed to be, as Chesterton said, that light that sort of spanned across the Middle Ages. And so again, we talked about this when we talked about the Donatist controversy of purity culture, of keeping things right, you know, like you're not allowed in the church because you're not good enough. We have to keep this sense of unity. It's not about tribalism, who's in, who's out, but by cultivating our unique practices and by being obedient to them, we actually open up a pathway for that sort of stuff to be cultivated. Yeah, please.
I'm not quite sure how to phrase this as a question,
Sure.
but into that discussion about like keeping a church simple versus having a church ornate, we struggle, I think, in general as people and as a church through history with fuzzy things about, because we think of truth being, if truth is truth, then it's this thing, and then that's what it is.
Right.
And then if someone else has a different idea, well, that's not truth, and so we can't accept that, and then that causes a conflict and a tension with us. And we really struggle having the idea of that, well, this is okay for this person, but that's not okay for me, and what's okay for me, this is how my relationship with God, and this is what I feel is true for me, and you know, and letting someone else be okay with what's true for them, or what they hold to be important to them.
Well, at the risk of quoting somebody who's probably not, what is truth? That becomes the question. And if Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, again, I sort of go back to this principle of the principle that Christ is not a principle. Christ is a person. The truth that is Christ. See, if truth is transcendental, this is one of the reasons why we put it in these categories. If beauty, truth, and goodness are transcendental, then I have to hold it openly. I don't get to own it. I don't ever get to say I own the truth. The truth is what I live into. And therefore, this is where I use that phrase. It's infinite in its modalities. Some people will prefer sunsets, and some people will prefer sunrises, and some people will prefer rainy days, some people will prefer sunny days. But there has to be a line at which we say the celebration of banality and violence, and those are ugly. That's not good. That's not true. That's not beautiful. And it's not just a subjective turn that we're looking to. And that's part of the reason why, like in week 2, when we talked about heresy and orthodoxy, that's exactly what we're trying to center on. What is it that we really have to agree is foundational, so that then the expressions that flow out of it can be infinite. They can be totally different. They can look, but they all come from the same core and the same center. That's what the work of the church is always trying to do, is to, and it's what means, one of the reasons why I'm a proud Anglican in some ways is because the Anglicans are almost allergic to method and theory. That once you ossify things into like a theory, it's like, well, God's going to break that boundary, so you can't really do it. And what it means is, and it's one of the reasons why the Anglicans have always been so tied to the intellectual tradition and the academy. It's so like the Anglicans really believe that like the pastor and teacher are connected, because it requires the cultivation of wisdom for you to know how to respond in certain situations. You can't just go back to the board and be like, what's the rule on that? Oh, that's the rule? That's how we're... No, they require new conversations. Some people think that gets them into a lot of trouble. It's one of the reasons why the Anglican Church is so divided right now on, say, the gay issue, because it's like, because they're willing to have the conversation. They don't just look to a rule board and go like, well, we always said this. They open it up, right? Because it requires mediation. I kind of think that's the right way to go. But what are we confessional about? What's our foundational claim? The person of Christ, the unity of Christ, the human and the divine together, who was raised from the dead for my salvation, right? I mean, that becomes the sort of paramount thing. I hope this is answering the question to some degree. I mean, but it's trying to say it's all sticky. It's a little, right? And that's why it's also good to, when we think of truth, we don't isolate it as just truth. Truth, beauty, and goodness have to go together. They work together. And the church often gets into trouble of doing this, trying to talk about like, well, this is what's true, and battling with what's true, and nobody asks, is it good or beautiful? It's got to be both of those things as well in order for it to withstand. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
When you talk about the survival of art and culture and literature and so on,
Yes.
During the Middle Ages, it seems to me that when I think about it, and I don't a lot, but it seems to me it was because it was tied up partially to a very, very strong political system in the church.
Yes.
And now today, there's a book out, I'm sure you've read it, it's called John Wayne and Jesus.
Yep, very familiar. Yep.
And I see
Jesus
the same kind of thing. I see where Saddleback just this week
Yes.
pulled out of the Southern Baptist because they
Yep.
had a woman teaching
Yeah.
pastor. Or they were thrown out, I guess.
Yeah, major.
But I'm always frightened when I like to think that we put good people, thoughtful people, Christian people in the right places. But beyond that, when it becomes a political movement,
I agree.
I get awful scared.
I completely agree, and I think it's actually kind of the battle of our time. Like if I were to look at right now Christianity in the West, certainly, and I always emphasize that because Christianity, like first of all, we think of ourselves as the majority. We're not. The global South is where Christianity is growing, right? There are more African Christians than there are Christians in the West. Anyway, but the issue we face here is certainly, I think Christian nationalism is maybe the main thing that we should be looking at, trying to pick, with the rise of Donald Trump, 2016, that whole thing, that movement. That book, Jesus and John Wayne, I do recommend it. Actually, I haven't read it. I know the author, and I've seen enough interviews that I would still probably give my blessing to it as a book. But a lot of the point of what she's trying to say there is that this culture of John Wayne, machismo, Christian, masculine, whatever, that all that energy and vibe being brought into Christianity they've been conflated, they've been brought together. And so then their version of like, when you talk about servanthood, what is the common American Christian understanding? Let's say Republican, I'll name it. I mean, like what's their understanding of being a servant? Well, it's having a gun on my hip and protecting right? Like it's a version of servanthood that looks very different, I think, than what somebody like Dallas Willard is going to say. Because what Dallas Willard is going to say is, servanthood looks like if you don't pick up your cross, you can't follow me. You have to die. You have to die to these things. So how do we serve our political order, right? It becomes a major question. It doesn't mean that we become apolitical. I've said that before. It doesn't mean that we can't kind of involve ourselves or that you don't vote or something. I'm not telling you to do any of that. What I'm saying is Christians don't hold their hope in some political ideology. We don't think that a politician's going to come around and save it because we're constantly in this dialectical flux. And I'm trying to die and deny myself so that I can serve better. And if we believe that if we deny ourselves in the way that Christ is referring to, lose our life in order to gain it, then the political machinations and whatever those appear to be, they matter in a very different way to us. I'm not saying they don't matter, but they don't matter in the way that we're not thinking of fulfillment in that sense. A lot of those Republican nationalists are caught up, most of them are Zionists, right? That's another thing. Like they believe in we got to support Israel at all costs because that will bring upon the eschaton. And it's bad theology. It's very bad theology. It's pernicious. It gets into the wild. I don't want to get too political on all that stuff, but I mean, it is not, I don't see the heart of Jesus there. right? And it goes back to this. It goes back to freedom. That's how they're not defining freedom properly. They're defining freedom by libertarian, like, I don't tread on me. I get to do what I want. That's not Christian freedom. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, so just connecting with Eric a wee bit, and even what Joan just said. So, the place I struggle is that area, again, that you were sort of talking about, where, so you've got truth.
Yeah.
But I think my question is, how do you deal or live with that truth amongst others who have different opinion about that same truth? Because to Eric's, what I picked up with Eric is exactly that. It just seems that we just keep on killing each other. And when I say killing each other, it looks like different things. It looks like the Baptist church is splitting off and becoming independent Baptist and becoming, all sorts of different Baptists. And it means Anglicans or my dad's Presbyterian. You're now seeing splits in Presbyterian church over the whole sexual issue, right? It just seems to me that all we accomplish when we hold truth to a degree that we end up saying we cannot sup, we cannot break bread with another brother or sister.
Yeah.
And so I kind of want to know, how do you hold truth and still maintain the ability to say, I don't fully understand myself, and I can still break bread with those who disagree with an aspect of that?
First of all, thank you for the softball question. No. Yeah, exactly. Just lob that one up. It's an incredibly difficult question. And here's where my mind goes. This is all I will say, really, is that what if it can't ever be as simplistic as this, but it really just comes down to, you have to determine what you confessionally are willing to say is the truth and not be willing to kill for it, but be willing to die for it. The whole Christian life is cruciform. And to me, that simply is that I just don't understand. This is what the main thing I don't understand about Christian nationalism, for instance, is this notion that they all believe that, like, going to war, having a gun, my right to bear arms and stuff, is somehow completely compatible with the gospel. It is not, fundamentally. Now, you can get into a whole conversation about passivity and pacifism, and we can go there if you want, but, and I'm not propagating, or I'm not trying to say that we all need to be hardcore pacifists, because that's another vague term. But Christianity does rest on the idea that I have to give my life in order to gain it. So whatever I think to be the confessional truth, there's a major part of understanding that is simply, I need to kind of do that quietly. I need to do that for myself. And if I am hated for doing it because I don't accept other people's doctrines or something like that, so be it. That's where I take from Jesus saying, like, to the disciples, you go and preach the good news. If they don't accept it, wipe the dust from your feet, leave it alone. And then they suffer persecution. I think, so again, I can go back to the LGBTQ issue because I think it's a good one where you're finding a lot of that strife. And what I want to say for myself is, I wrestle with the issue. I come to a conclusion of what I believe to be true. I keep that truth for me. And I know everyone is trying to convert everybody into, and I'm not saying that that's a problem in the sense of at least trying to state your case. But if somebody comes against me and hates me for that belief, I have to allow them to hate me. And that's the difference, is that my retaliation isn't to say who wins in this. I have to be willing to die. I have to be willing to die to that truth. And it might mean that. And that's the only thing the Christian can do, is say, I agree to disagree. And I have to, and hopefully we can come together on enough of it. Because you're right, until certain, like within a church community, if we don't agree on the baptismal rite or the Eucharist or on the same-sex issue or whatever, it's going to be hard to grow together. But at least within these communities, we have to say, well, here are the things that we confessionally state. And if it's not appealing enough to the rest of the world, or they don't think we're coming on board with it, we have to be willing to pray and love those people and allow them to. It's not the best answer in one sense. There's no finality to that. But we have to hold to our convictions. And one of those convictions should be that I should never hold it over somebody else, right? I mean, that I can't force anybody into. Christianity is not a religion of coercion. It's not a religion of defense in that way either. I think that's another thing that I'm trying to get at is like cyclical violence, right? I mean, like you said, if we're just going to poke each other's eyes out, you're not winning in that ever. The only way the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. If that's true, then the only way that my conviction and my truth stands as the truth that it is if I'm willing to die for it and never willing to take life for it, right? That you can kill me, but that's where I stand. So you got to really, it comes down to like, when people say it's not the hill I'm going to die on, I think it's like we got to pick the hills we're going to die on. But it's the hill you're going to die on, not going down in a blaze of glory trying to shoot your way out of the, it's like, no, I'm willing to die because I believe this to be true. And then it becomes a matter of like what cultivates the life of Christ, what looks like Christ, it's as simple as and as complicated as that. What is true, what is good, what is beautiful. And so again, part of these debates is often like the moralist question. This is what's good. You should do this because it's good. Again, is it beautiful? Is it true? Is it right? They all have to work together. Yeah.
It goes back to the metaphysics,
Yeah.
like you were saying, right? Like I think
Nature
that's
of
the
reality.
foundational, right? Because you can, like someone who is fighting for, say, gay rights, there's a lot you can agree on in that fight, but we can also be, like we can be agreeing on, your sexuality shouldn't determine your tax break, it shouldn't determine what jobs you get, what jobs you don't get, lots to agree on, it shouldn't determine how violent you are treated or not treated. But we have to also realize we could also be coming at that same conclusion from very different metaphysics.
Yes.
Right? So our metaphysics is we have a loving God who created us. Their metaphysics might be just, well, I'm an autonomous individual.
That's
So
right.
I think like tracing these arguments back to what are the metaphysics?
So using that word actually is very helpful. I think you're right, because using metaphysics to talk about metaphysics being what is the nature of reality. Again, if Christians understand themselves as being within a completely different disposition than what the majority world will think, that's important. And Christians understanding that it's like, I see the nature of reality through a cruciform God is very different than the way the world sees things. It's definitely going to change our approach to how we handle conflict, right? Because it goes to this point that I'm saying. It's like the Christian can only be sort of willing to give their life. You cannot take a life. It's just, you can't do it. As a matter of fact, that becomes the sort of paramount debate that happens during the Passion of Christ, right? Caiaphas is the political order which says what's most expedient. Better that one man die for the sake of the nation, right? Than that all should perish. And Jesus says, no, I won't participate. I won't go into that. No, I'll be willing to die for beauty, truth, goodness, and what that unleashes. But metaphysically, and this is exactly goes to the point of what I was saying about my apologetic disposition, my way of trying to like, how do I want to approach Christian faith and give people reason to understand, to follow, give a defense of the faith, is to reorient their metaphysic, is to be like, well, actually, you're telling yourself this story, and that's not the way the story goes. Because that's what metaphysics is, right? It's like, what is the story we tell ourselves? It's a good way to kind of approach it. What's the narrative you think you're in? What's the basis of, the foundation for meaning, and where is it all headed? What's our teleology? What's the end point? Right? And it's why, like for instance, the Westminster Confession, the first thing, what is the chief end of man, is to love God and enjoy him eternally. So again, this is my point, is that it's like my goal is to worship God. That's my goal. Everything flows out from that. So I can't know truth, goodness, beauty. I can't know God. I can't know Jesus unless I'm in that state of worship. And that metaphysically orients me toward a certain, right, a cruciform life that doesn't, you have a question?
Yeah, just a thought was, while you're talking about it, a lot of times it might be the reason we pursue these different things about truth is because we're trying to create a perfect me or a perfect church or a perfect something. And I was just looking at the Wise thing, it says,
We're not
where it
perfect.
starts. It starts
right.
at an interesting place. You know,
Exactly.
on that basis,
Exactly.
we start with the understanding we're not perfect.
I think it's exactly right. I mean, it's that theology with an open palm. It's like even your statement that you confess is a statement of like, we're willing to negotiate. I have to be able to move, right? Because I won't always be right about the things that I'm saying. And it doesn't rest on me, it rests on Christ. You know, I think that's the statement. We believe life's better with Christ because I'm not perfect. He was, okay? So I'm trying to follow that. I'm trying to cultivate that within me. While we're talking about all this is the thing, this is all this stuff on Dallas Willard, but I wanted to just talk about this in general when we're talking about the cultivation of art, beauty, what it was putting in the world, but also this understanding of reason, truth, how we understand it. This was illustrated in art in a major way during the Renaissance period, which comes at the end of the Middle Ages. And I always thought this was interesting, and it just is sort of a visual illustration, I think, for some of the ways in which we think about Christianity and truth and those sorts of things. In the High Renaissance, this is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, you have this expression of everything is symmetrical. Everything is sort of, creation is ordered. Everything is in its place. Christ is in the center, right? It's triangulated. You have everything kind of reaches its apex in Jesus and everything flows out from Jesus. This is this view that you find in art. The triangle kind of is a symbol of like the mathematical truth of reality, right? That everything is ordered and sustained and goes like this. So this is all what's being emphasized in the High Renaissance. The movement after that is different. I have this painting on my wall. This is a Caravaggio. It was part of the Baroque period, and this is called the Conversion of St. Paul, when Paul is thrown from his horse. But he's doing something very purposeful there. Note that what he's saying is, when we convert to Christ, our natural understanding of the world is actually flipped on its head. Everything becomes paradoxical. So when we approach, I'm going back now to when we approach Darwinian evolution, and it gives us a version of the world that dictates itself by a narrative that says survival of the fittest, it's not to say that that is untrue, but it's to say that Christ inverts these categories. That through revelation, our reason is flipped on its head, actually. Da Vinci's still right. I mean, everything still reason comes from Christ outward. That's the metaphysic, right? That is the reality. But there became this understanding of the division, and he uses a artistic technique called chiaroscuro, which is light and shading. So there's dark in one area, and then light is being illuminated on Paul as he converts. This has always just been a reminder to me of the way in which, and this is a famous phrase of Karl Barth, Christ comes to us in that he contradicts us. That reason is not antithetical to the Christian religion. We are the Logos faith. But Logos and reason are turned on their head by Jesus. They're flipped around. Revelation reorients us to a more peculiar understanding of the world in which we live. And this is what was being expressed and cultivated through the Christian movement. I don't know if that complicates or makes things better, but I always loved that illustration of just the way in which we're talking about these things. It's not so straightforward. You're not going to, when we talk about truth, what do I believe? What do you believe? You can't pin it down in some formula. It exists. It happens in this conversion, right? It happens in this moment. When Paul is converted, he's struck blind for 3 days. And there has to be some understanding in the way in which, if we're seeking Jesus for answers to questions, we're going to be entered into a sort of wilderness at first, right? That's the whole narrative of the gospel from beginning to end, is we are the Israelites who are free from captivity but enter into a wilderness. And it goes actually to this understanding of beauty as well in the world of what our gaze needs to be fixed upon. This is why I actually started with Colossians 3:1. That is a favorite scripture of Dallas Willard's. Willard talks about the ways in which we cultivate ourselves and the way we focus on things that are above. We look to that which is good, true, and beautiful. We keep our eyes fixated on those things because otherwise we get caught up in the world, and all of a sudden we acquiesce to it. We start getting into Christian nationalism. We're looking too much at the political order as being the answer to our problem. No, it's keep your eyes on the things that are above, because you've been raised with Christ, right? Die to the self, enter into this. And when we talk about those things, it's funny that perhaps this is myself just relating these things, but when we talk about keeping your eyes fixed on the things that are above, I do look to our humanist tradition of literature and art and architecture, and I would say certain things evoke a certain sense of beauty, and other things do not. I don't know if you guys have noticed, art is really ugly these days. Art got progressively worse in the postmodern period. Really. I mean, I should have shown visuals, but I mean, art history, by the way, is my other major fascination. I would study it all the time if I could, but I have too many useless degrees, my wife says. No, I think I got 3 now. None of them make money. But art history would be the next one. I would totally add that to the list, right? And you get into this period of art where, like, Marcel Duchamp takes a urinal and turns it on its side and calls it a fountain, right? And he's making a point about, like, all of a sudden when you rid the world of God, you rid the world of meaning, then art becomes this escape into, like, what is art? What is truth? What is beauty? Does it matter? Isn't it all just subjective? No, it's not. It's transcendental. Okay? Bach is better than Bieber. That is just like... And that's not a debate. That's the thing, is like people want to talk about it. It's just like, well, no, that's not a shit. No, it's true. There is something about it that makes certain things more edifying. And again, the reason I just went into this whole abstract thing, I just want to keep relating it back to the notion of servanthood, is that Christian living, as we cultivate ourselves, as we adopt a sort of like virtue ethic where we cultivate the virtues within us, we serve the world not just in these practical daily life ways, which of course we will, but we become a thing of beauty that the world looks upon and goes like, what are they doing over there? I always use the illustration in Exodus 3, actually, of the burning bush. When you read that story, the line that always catches me is Moses is simply working as a shepherd in the field, and it says, he turned aside to see this wondrous thing. That as God appears in the theophany of the burning bush, he needs to attract the attention of Moses first. He doesn't just start in with what's true and what's good. There's a beautiful moment that occurs that Moses goes, I need to pay attention to this. And the church has to be a servant in the world, the church needs to imitate that. It needs to be thinking of itself in, like, what is the expression that we give ourselves? Are we edifying the culture in this way? I heard one person explain it, actually. I think it was Bishop Barron. If you ever listen to his podcast, he's pretty good, actually. He's like the evangelical guy for the Roman Catholics. But he did a whole thing about truth, beauty, goodness, and he talked about, like, say you wanted somebody to get really into baseball, and I'm trying to get my wife to watch the NFL or something like that, right? You don't just start by explaining the rules. The best way to do it would be you take them to a game. You bring them into the experience, and you get them to see the grass and the sky and breathe the air in and you got to see that it's beautiful, and then you're invited into that space, and then I can tell you what's true about it. Then I can tell you what's good about it. But we have to begin with this sort of expression of, is what we're doing beautiful? Does it produce these sort of things that excite our passions? Okay, so I went way off track from kind of where I wanted. There was a whole middle section here, and I'll try and... Oh yeah, we're definitely over time. So that's good, because we can talk about it next week. So I will say we'll end here. I'm happy to stick around and take questions. This was excellent. Last week's the final week. We're going to talk more on this in the sense of the relevance of the church living in a post-Christian age. But I'm also very curious if anybody has big burning questions that they're like, can we really hit on this a little bit more? I'd love to know them. You can ask them either right now and we can save them, or you could write them down. I don't know the best way to do that. If people have questions they want to write down, they could maybe give them to Dan, and then you can give them to me, and we'll we'll do that for next week. But yeah, the thing we'll touch on that we didn't get to here is some of that Dallas Willard stuff, some of that practical sense of cultivating within us spiritual formation. And the reason why that's important is because Dallas has a really great outline of this is human nature aligned. And so it goes all the way back to what we've been talking about with the councils and the creeds. That's why it's all connected, okay? If Christ takes on human nature, then it's really important for us to say, what is human nature? What is our human nature that then needs to be cultivated in the way of Christ, okay? And he has these are the 6 aspects of human nature, and then how do we order it? And again, he uses the word service, right? How does one serve the other? How does our thought serve our feeling? How does it serve God, right? And a disordered understanding of it would be that instead it's the soul serves the body, right? Or does the body serve the soul? So we'll get into that next week. Anyway, that's kind of it, but thanks very much. And any questions? Everyone's free to go. Well, there's the heart out. You're all free to go. Thanks.